Welcome to our Creating the Team Officers, Creating the City Officer, the Club Officer Team. I originally got involved in working with volunteer groups back in 1993 when I became a stay-at-home mom who was never home. Over the last 27 years, I've volunteered in over 40 different organizations, and it's taught me a lot about how to work with people, what works and what doesn't. I did get involved in Toastmasters in 2003, but ironically enough, it wasn't until 2015 when I had an inspirational mentor show me what being a DTM was really about, and I started recognizing that we have the opportunity, in the same way we learn to become good speakers, to become good team members, mentors, and leaders. I've been involved in leadership for the last 5 years and will never quit. Just like I found out that I got rusty at speaking, I want to keep working and honing in my team building and communication skills. So the next thing I wanted to share is that we say that, have you ever heard the saying that if you want to know about water, don't ask a fish? It's ubiquitous. Communication and leadership is everywhere. We live together to do that. But the interesting part of that ubiquity is we often don't really see what's going on. And this is something that we really need to take a good look at. So, let's see. What we're going to cover today is what I call the 3 principles. Those are the basic values that the group needs to hold. And then guardrails. These are the things where we can, if we cross over these lines, we're going to have problems. And we do. I mean, we're human beings, but the idea is to have them as something to call each other on and look at ourselves in order to get back in the lane. And then I'm going to talk about the 4 phases of what you do within your clubs. Again, all of these things are not going to surprise you at all. But the question is to take a look at, am I really doing them? Am I really using them? So let's start with the 3 principles. And Abhilash, where are we as far as time goes? How much more time do I have left for my presentation? Part of this,
yeah. You're only at 2:30, so you have 3 more minutes.
Oh, wait, 2:30, okay.
Off the principal section.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Okay. The first one, and I'm sure if you've read any organizational leadership books, trust. Trust is a must. There in the book, the 5 functions of a the five dysfunctions of a team. There's a pyramid of these 5 characteristics, and the base, the ground, is trust. People have to feel safe. And we need to create that by being authentic. And that reminds me of my work on city council and politics, when we talk about politicians. The point is that if we aren't being authentic, then people aren't going to be able to trust us. And if we aren't able to be authentic, then we're not really working on ourselves. We're working on images of ourselves. Totally important to that is vulnerability. That is such a strength, to be able to look at our strengths and our weaknesses and to recognize when we're doing things wrong that we are, and to be able to correct. I have a really funny story about that. I was giving a speech a couple of years ago when my youngest son, who we adopted from South Korea, graduated from college. Of course, I'm the bragging mom, and I'm talking about what a great kid he was and how busy he was. And I talked about Scouts, how he got his Eagle Scout Award, and he was so good at being in the group. I showed them this picture, and you can see my son right here at the bottom by the Philmont Scout Ranch sign. He's obviously Asian. And I talked about how he was the only white kid in the group, but everybody wanted them in his group because he made it fun and the kids weren't as miserable and missing their games. I had a person get very upset with me at the meeting and say that I was, essentially what I heard her say was that I was being racist. I was taken aback, let it go. But what I did was I talked with her after the meeting. And it turns out she is a woman from the Middle East who's had a very difficult time. And she says, I'm always judged. I'm usually the only person of color in her profession in the rooms. And when I listened to her, I was aware of that I really was biased in what I was saying, and saying that it was cute that my son was the only non-white face or the only person of color in the room was not the best way to describe that. Because of that conversation that we had, I had my huge aha and learned to see things differently. And she and I have been good friends ever since. The next thing is listening. To the point about that is we need to listen to respect. As I did with her, be curious, listen. Don't ever do things like roll your eyes or act like you're not listening. Try to be there and try to hold people in respect and understand what they have, where they're coming from. Then the last thing to do is we need to learn to share with one another. And this is the strength of human beings and our cultures. When we have people coming with different skills and different perceptions, when we can put the best of those together, we're going to create the most effective teams. And again, we get to learn from one another. And the other thing is, there's always problems. If we're pretending there's not problems, we've got a problem. So be able to recognize the things that we need to work on or problems that we have. And then very important is that the way we talk about them, just like when we give an evaluation for a speech, it's about what the person does, not about who's doing it. In a speech evaluation, you would never say, that was a crummy speech, you were nervous, right? You would say, I noticed you stuttering, or I noticed this, congratulations, and keep going. These are the things that we need to bring to our officers' meetings as well. Safe place, listen, and be able to share. And with that, I'll take any questions or comments for this particular section. We have 5 minutes.
Well, we've had a few questions.
Okay.
So starting with the first one, the question is, how can we create a more cohesive club officer team when we just meet briefly on Zoom?
That's a really good point. Not being in person is tough. Again, we talk about vocal variety, gestures. You don't see those as clearly. I'm not really looking at you, even though it might look like it is. So if you make a weird expression or an expression, I'm not going to be able to respond to it, and it'll look like I'm not even listening to you. And we don't have the before and after. The way to really do that is to talk with one another outside of meetings too. It's important to get to know one another a bit, although you need to be careful somewhat. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's what I would suggest, yes. And sometimes another thing I'm suggesting to groups is that in that session, get people on ahead of time. And if nothing else, there's a thing called roses, thorns, and buds. And I usually do roses and thorns. What do you, what's going well for you? You know, what are you struggling with? And I'll tell you in these times, there's a lot that people have to say about that.
Okay, the next question is, how can a team member be motivated who is not taking agreed action following club executive meetings?
That's a good question. Now, you may or may not be successful at resolving this, but the relationship component is, again, important. I would suggest you have a conversation with them, find out what's going on, ask them about their work, the work that they're supposedly doing, what's working for them, what's not. See if you can understand the underlying reasons of why it's not getting done. Sometimes people are just too busy. They've got some things coming up and they don't have enough time to do it, but they won't just say that or ask for help. So it could be as much as just finding out where they are and providing some strategic help. The worst is you can find out, oh, this person's never going to do what they're going to do. At least you know that going forward. You don't have to tell them they're, again, you hope that you can have these honest conversations about it. But sometimes people don't, especially in the volunteer world. They ain't going to lose their job. So recognizing, one, if you can help what's going on, and two, again, are they going to do it or not? And if it really needs to be done, then you're going to have to find someone else to do it.
Next question is, why is it that some club officers seem to expect others to do the work of keeping the club together?
That's an interesting question. What I'm hearing in it is that it's something that I've heard talked about is that people are in the stands instead of on the court. They're watching the game, and they think that they're actually doing something by talking about the game rather than actually being down there playing. And again, sometimes that can be a characteristic of a person. Sometimes, but it's good to have an off the meeting conversation with them to kind of get to where they are, what's going on, and what they can do. But again, in any organization, sometimes people are who they are and they aren't willing to change. We hope that if you come in with the objective that I want to become a better leader, you're not going to become a better leader by doing nothing. Just like if I were to give a speech, if I go in, I don't plan, I just get up and talk for 5 minutes and sit down, and then I'm offended by any evaluation of how to do it better, I'm not going to learn anything. It's the same way. So hopefully what you do is you find people. Sometimes you just have who you have, but sometimes I'd be looking to get someone in who's really interested in doing the work and working on their leadership skills. And again, those conversations, recognizing that you got to do something to learn. Just sitting there in the stands isn't going to work.
Okay, and the last question is a rather lengthy question, so, but it is our last one. Our club president asked the club officers to please sign up on the online club website agendas for the next 4 months, at least as chairman, toastmaster, and speaker.
Mm-hmm.
However, the agendas for 2021 are blank, as has been the case each month until the final week before the meeting, where the chairman, toastmaster combined role has at great difficulty attempted to gain members on the agenda.
I've seen a couple things that work well. One is 4 months is way too long. Most clubs that I've seen, they'll go out maybe a month to 6 weeks on a schedule, and they encourage people to sign up. The other thing that often is done is, or some clubs do, and a couple of mine have done, are they, at the end of each meeting, if there are open roles for the next week, you ask participants at the meeting that time if they're willing to step up and do them. The last thing I would suggest is, again, people aren't going to learn unless they do. So the VPE or VP of membership should be, or someone, again, you can vary things. You don't have to rigidly follow the Toastmaster format, but do one-on-one conversations with members, encourage them to speak, encourage them to at least sign up to speak, so that the most critical things is to having ahead of time our speakers and of course the Toastmaster, usually depending on the role of the Toastmaster. But if you're having the Toastmaster be the one sending out information, those you want to get filled out across the 6 weeks and try to get it done ahead of time. But, and again, it varies from club to club. But yeah, again, a lot of times it's the personal touch with people that makes a difference. Okay, going on. The 5 guardrails, and I have an acronym to look at these different characteristics. The idea is these are things to look at. If they're not being followed, usually there's problems. And again, we're human, so how do I work with them? Okay, and Abhilash, let's see. I have how long for this section?
You have 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay, all right. Let's see. Okay. The first thing, T, time. What are we spending our time talking about? And this is actually the most important. Just like in our meetings, we want our club officer meetings to have a schedule and to be followed and to make sure that we're, on task. But it also means a little more than that to me. And that is that you are having interesting meetings, relevant conversations. And I'm going to talk about a club from hell, the club officer group from hell. This is a mixture of some real things they're based on real things that I've either had happen to me or I've heard other people happen, but I'm changing it just a little bit to protect the not so innocent. At these clubs, I signed up with this club and they had 3 people who'd been there forever, a couple of people who wouldn't sign up to be officers, but had been members for a couple years. And then they had a lot of people coming in and going out within, sign up for 6 months, maybe a year, and then they're gone. And what happened was it was 3 old guys who'd been around forever. They started the meeting by talking about cars and racing and sports. And they basically traded roles for president every year. And they trade around the top roles, but it was always them. And the meetings, of course, were boring for people to begin with. And they didn't really build relationships. Both results and relationships matter. So you've got to involve people, and you always want to be bringing more people in and encouraging new people. The next thing, the E, is about effect. What is the effect of our communication? Now, these 3 guys, they were good speakers, but a couple of them, and one in particular, always gave speeches about politics. Talked about things like, immigrants are stealing our jobs and costing us money, and there's all these criminals. And he'd go on these diatribes about stuff like that. Not real inspiring and not very positive. And I brought it up at one of our meetings to say, maybe we need some boundaries about what we talk about in the meetings, because we'd have young people come and people of color, and they hear a speech like that and you don't see them again. So I brought it up at the meeting, and his response to me was to say that, I was just being too sensitive. We live in America and land where you can, we have freedom of speech, and, you're just being too sensitive. Got nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. And it's the same thing. We've got to think about what is the effect of what we're saying and doing with each other. The next thing is accuracy. Now, this one's a little bit tough, but it's like, are we on the right page? Are we seeing what we're dealing with in an accurate enough way that we'll take actions to do so? In my last example, the guy saying, people are just too sensitive. I mean, he's not recognizing the revolving door. He's missing people's responses. And if we can't look at what we're facing, you're not going to get anywhere. We see a lot of that, especially to me in the news world, where we have, there's a difference between objective data and subjective stuff. And usually, to me, the key way that you see the subjective, and subjective, it's not necessarily bad, but it's when you're saying, if you see adjectives, that's usually a sign. And I have a funny example of that. When I was running for re-election in 2008 and Barack Obama was on the ballot, I was going door to door talking to people. And I went to a door and I knocked on it and I was talking to this fellow and he says, well, what do you think about Obama? And I said, well, what do you think? And he goes, Obama is a criminal. And I said, huh, what did he do that's illegal? And I watched the guy's eyes. And when he heard the question, he went, and then I could see he's thinking in his mind and he's not coming up with anything. And then he's got a surprised expression on his face. A lot of times people won't differentiate between subjective information that's not backed by data. And I said to the guy, I probably lost his vote, but I said, well, you know, if I hold up a gun and say, give me your money, you can call me a criminal. But just saying that I'm a criminal with nothing behind it, you know, was kind of my point. I'm sure I lost his vote. But again, that's what we have to look at. We have to be curious enough to try to understand what's really happening. And then we can come up with appropriate meanings and reasons for why it's going on. Clarity. This is a really fishbowl one where you don't see it. The words, all words mean something slightly different to people. A tree, if you live in the Northwest versus if you live in the tropics, gives you a different image, a different idea. And so what we say can be very nuanced, and we often don't recognize when people aren't understanding what we mean. And I have a really fun example of that. I was invited through Toastmasters. I was a Pathways guide for some clubs around the world where in areas where there weren't enough clubs to form districts. So they asked us to be virtual Pathways guides. So I had 3 clubs in South America and 1 in Lahore, Pakistan. The one in Lahore, Pakistan was a club of teachers at a school district. And they had this big district event where they invited teachers, professors, donors, even the governor of Punjab came with some of his ministers. They asked me to come speak at it, and I did a presentation on the power of communication. And I was really stressing about how do I say things that have meaning? I'm going to a culture I don't even know. So I chose stories that I thought everyone could identify with. And I showed this screen. This was one of my slides. And I talked about when my daughter was a little girl and I was driving past a car sales lot. And she said to me, Mama, why do they put balloons on the cars? And I said, so we'll stop and buy the cars. And she said, if you buy a car, do you get to keep the balloon? And they all laughed. They could get it. We have a common understanding of children and their different levels of development. That applies to everything. And again, no two of us are the same, completely the same. But we do have cultural things and being aware of what people are saying. And part of that is stuff you hear about, like making sure to ask people, say back what you heard them say or ask other questions. But we want to make sure we get to what we call the same page with our understanding. That's where we are going to be most effective in being able to work with one another. So again, mutual understanding is what we're going for here. The last one, it's very esoteric, but it is also very important. And it ties back up into how we spend our time. What do we hope will come from our meeting? What do we hope to see? And part of that too, and this is the one that takes vulnerability and courage, is what is our intention in what we're saying? And sometimes we have to be aware of that. If you feel yourself feeling defensive, what you're saying may be more about protecting what you feel about yourself and your own image rather than about what the group does as a whole. So this one is always, to me, a very interesting thing to look at, and it's a really easy one to ask. It's like, well, what were you looking for out of this? What did you mean by this? What was your intention? And when we look at these 5 items, this helps us, and we can talk with one another in a safe way about it. This helps us to be able to communicate. Again, from the first part, if you have a safe place, then you can have these kind of conversations. And a couple things I've learned is that we learn most from our mistakes. And I can tell you some of the best lessons I learned was from a hugely dysfunctional period of time I spent with one volunteer group. But what I took away from it was, we had all this kind of nasty stuff going on. And I came up with this saying, we lead in the light of life and love. And I realized that if that's what I'm hoping for, to create this and have effect and hope to create this energy towards light and doing good things together, that's going to help. And I also learned problems go in and solutions go out. If you have a problem with someone, can you set up the guardrails so that you can come talk with the person first? And if you can't resolve it directly with the person, then maybe ask a mutual friend or mentor, but get help. But work out problems rather than spreading them around. And I'm sure you guys have seen some of that, where people won't talk about what's happening in the meeting, but outside of the meeting, they're busy talking about all the stuff that's going wrong. Nothing gets done from that. It creates no good. So these are the things I suggest you be able to talk to one another. And when you have problems, unless it's safe enough in the group, go to the individual person and see if you can resolve it. And if you all are coming from the place of trying to do this, you're going to grow. So now we have time for questions.
We have a few. First question, do you think it's important to set rules on what to avoid for speeches in the club? Like avoid sex, religion, politics, etc. Does this hinder hearing different opinions, which is also part of growing as a speaker?
Yes, and what I would say is again, to the point of getting to know people, it depends. For the most part, I would say starting, yes. To the group of guys, they should have not been talking about politics. And we do have some standards. A lot of clubs, they will not allow using foul language or talking about sex. Politics is another one. But what you want to do is, again, is look at the group as a whole. On the other hand, there is another club that is all about politics. It's a political club. One of the things I think they learn to do there is be more effective in sharing the what, not just the attacking of the who. So I think that it's very valuable, but they do talk about politics, but it's the boundaries and it's safe and people know when they're going there. But for the most part, I would say yes. You probably want to set boundaries, because the hope of what you can't get from meetings is people learning communication skills. So if talking about things is going to offend and get in the way, you don't want them there.
Hey, Kate.
Yeah.
Can I just say something out of some experience?
Sure.
If you're going to talk about subjects that are potentially really good differential conversational points, but you don't want it to become volatile, just be aware of our words, which is what we are doing here in Toastmasters. Go back to what you were saying, watch your adjectives, don't make it inflammatory, make it inclusive, and make it about sharing ideas and open for discussion, and then you should be fine.
Well, that helps a lot, but I still think that there's certain subjects right now. Politics is too volatile for people. Mm-hmm. It's just too volatile.
Oh, I
would say most clubs shouldn't. But anyways, I'm sorry, Allison, I got to keep going. I've got to take a couple more questions.
Sorry, my bad.
No, it's okay. Thanks for sharing.
We have one more question.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Can you talk about strategies for sharing the load? It's so tempting to do everything yourself.
Okay. For that, that's a good one. And that is honestly a very typical flaw that I've seen in a lot of different groups, is that one person or a couple of people run the whole show. And it becomes a vicious circle, because if they're running the whole show, then they get used to running the whole show. And then people don't ever get out of the stands and get on the court. But what you can do, I would suggest, and this is in the purest form, if people are serving in roles and they really want to learn to be good team members, then what do you do on a team? You're not a good team member if all you do is show up and listen to people talk. You know, you have things you're responsible for. So encouraging people, if they want to learn to be good leaders and to help the club, what's your role as a vice president of education or treasurer or whatever role, and what are you going to do? Now, again, especially in volunteer organizations, sometimes we have to pick up the slack for people that aren't doing it. But if we have the idea going into the group, we create this safe place, we're going to try to get things done, and we're going to learn from what we do, then you have a better chance of doing that. And again, sometimes you need to politely let officers ask new people to be officers in order to get things done. And okay, so thank you for that. And I'll now continue to the next session. This one is going to be, you all know this. So no surprises here at all, but I'm going to talk about the 4 phases of what we go through. Now, you all know this, but the question I would have you think about is, do we really do it? So the first thing we do is we set our objectives at the club level. That's what I call getting ready for the shot. What do we look at? Common things with the club is we need more members. So we're going to try to get maybe 10 new members this year. Or, you know, maybe another one now I think should be for clubs is, how do we make our clubs good learning places for using this online technology? But what you're going to want to do is, as a group, look at what do we think we really need to do this year to either keep our club strong or to strengthen it in areas that are weak. So what are our overall objectives? The next thing is to come up with the plans of what we're going to do. And this is where you start differentiating the work. Who's going to work with who? What's the VP of PR going to do? Often, of course, they have the role of managing websites and Facebook pages and that kind of thing. But in these days, a real challenging thing are, what are our plans? What can we do to bring in new members in this virtual world? This is probably going to be around us for another 6 months. And so looking at particular things to try to implement. So that's taking aim. What's the target? And then taking aim. The next part, letting the shot go and executing. Off you go. So you've decided, okay, we're going to have a special Zoom meeting focused on how to do professional development. We're going to we find speakers. That's all part of the planning. And then the execution is, finding the speakers, getting it off, and then letting it rip. And then the last part is measuring. That's the evaluation. Where did we get towards that bullseye? Did it work? What went well? What was a bullseye? What sort of work we might want to change? And what was a total miss? Again, as human beings, we're never perfect. There's always things we can do. We always can do things better. There's always things we can learn from things that don't work well. If we take this approach, and it tends to be circular, it's not just over the year you have these 3 distinct phases. You tend to set objectives at the beginning of the year, generally speaking. But again, this can be an iterative process, but this is the process that we go through to actually execute and evaluate and learn. And as we learn to be better leaders, we are often too, that goes along with better results for the club. Just like when we have good meetings, that creates good results for our members. And that was a little bit fast, but again, that was it. So right now I've got, if there's any questions about these phases, feel free.
Okay, we have a few questions. What is a good frequency for club officers to meet to discuss those objectives, etc.?
I think what I've seen pretty standard is once a month. And that can be at a minimum. And sometimes it depends on what you're doing. If you have a group that's like, for instance, planning an open house, something that's going to create some more work, you may want to have, it depends on the group and the people in the group, you may want to have, you can do one of two things. You can either have additional meetings around the time in order to make sure that you're moving along and getting plans and executing them and getting, finding speakers or whatever, that kind of thing. And the other thing is sometimes you can form subcommittees. And if you form subcommittees that are responsible for those things, then you can still stick to your monthly schedule. But I think it's pretty tried and true that once a month tends to be a good amount for most clubs.
That was the only question.
Oh, okay. Well, at this point, I wanted to save time because I really want to hear from you. The best things we learn, again, Toastmaster, it's experiential, right? We get better by learning, and learning vicariously is a good way to do it. When we hear from what went well for other people or what problems or mistakes they heard, and especially what they learned, we can learn it without having to actually go through it ourselves. So I'd really like to open this up first to any more questions about any of these subjects and to share any comments. So any ahas you've gotten, anything that you think would be valuable for people to know. And again, it's always fun to hear experiences.
Hi, okay. My name's Marilee. I belonged in Vancouver to a club called Politically Speaking. We've since changed the name to Speak Your Mind, but it was sort of done in fun. And we had a position like an inspirator called Rant. And it was always quite funny to see people so intense talking about something. So somebody was from England, for example, and he would talk about how they need to do something in England, and he would rant about it. You're supposed to have passion. And we would just laugh and have it fun. And for table topics, sometimes it was situational. Okay, you're the mayor of Vancouver, and what are you going to do with closing traffic in Stanley Park? And we could just make it up, just anything, because we're not really the mayor of Vancouver. And it was just done in good taste and good fun. And for speeches, they weren't really controversial like the type that you mentioned, and not always political. And so we changed the name to Speak Your Mind because some guests said they don't know much about politics, or they said, well, why don't you always talk about politics, which we weren't. And one time, instead of table topics, we had dress as your political character or your party. So somebody dressed going for a party. She was called Candy from the party. And she just wants to have a party. And other ones was like Marco or whoever it was, a woman who had tons of different shoes in the Philippines. She had a bag of different shoes. And while she was talking, she kept changing her shoes. And somebody else was dressed as sort of a soldier type man, but she is a woman from South America. And they looked so realistic in their getup. And we just have fun. That's the idea. People enjoy having fun, and we learn having fun.
That's awesome. Yeah. And it's interesting that you changed your name to create it. Kind of a funny story I have is I'm a member of a group. The name was forever. We just changed it this year, but it was Trans Toasters. And the reason it's called Trans Toasters is it's because it's in Salem at the Department of Transportation. So it was Trans Toasters, but talk about clarity and the meaning of words. Now trans refers to transgender. So we would have people coming thinking they were joining or going to a transgender club, and it didn't work too well. So they're now called Top Dots. DOT is Department of Transportation. So good for you. But yeah, having that vision, and again, setting boundaries. So I know Allison, if you have more to say, Allison, feel free, but you can do political stuff. And again, you've got to have an understanding within the club of what to expect, because you're going to lose that safe place. If you're getting into things that are offending people and they don't feel like they can say anything about it, they're just going to leave. So it's important to be able to do that. And another thing that's really a good thing to do that you guys may or may not have heard of is when people leave, it's good to give them a call and not necessarily to be begging them to come back. I mean, if they feel like that, then that's not being very authentic, I mean, but, just to see kind of what's up and see if they're willing to share, so that, again, we learn from our mistakes. So hopefully it's not, oh, well, and if anyone ever says, oh, I'm just too busy, that's the polite way of backing out. So who else would like to share?
I feel one of the things that happens in a lot of clubs is the imbalance of the duties. Like most of the time, the VP education ends up doing like 50% of the 60% of the job, arranging meetings to tracking progress to everything. So how do you resolve it? Like especially to distribute the job between the 6-7 officers. Did you see this?
Yes. You're right. This is very common. And the VPE is often the biggest job in most clubs. So there's a couple of things to do. One in the past, what I've seen people do is sometimes they'll divide up the VPE. So they'll have someone helping the VPE, maybe taking part of it. So they'll divide up the work. And another thing that we now have the opportunity to do is to use pathways and get into that mentorship module. Again, leadership it's the best leaders I've met are inspirational leaders who help people do stuff and everybody learns from the experiences of doing. So I would encourage you, if you use the mentorship model, then you will have people working with other club members to work on the Pathways mentorship program. And that will help get people more active. And you can actually ask them to, encourage people to sign up for stuff and things like that. And another thing that I've seen that helps a lot is, again, asking people to say, you signed up to be this role at the beginning of the year. So, what do you think that's going to look like? And the club decide as a whole, what are you going to do for outreach? It's not necessarily one person. So sometimes it's just the person and sometimes it's a group, but getting people coming in and again, recognizing just like I'm not going to learn to be a good speaker if I never get up and speak. If you have people be officers, they really have an opportunity to work on team building and leadership and mentorship skills if they execute. So what are they going to execute and following that process of, ready, aim, fire, measure.
Hey, Kate, I have a question for you on something that you can comment on. Actually, in a different organization I was involved in, at a situation years ago where I had two people who were both tremendous volunteers, tremendous officers for this organization, but they didn't get along with each other at all. And so I made sure that I was able to give each of them responsibilities and roles where they didn't have to interact with each other. And they both did a great job. They both did tremendous work in the roles that they took on. But anytime they had to interact with each other was terrible. And
was it so, like, what was the underlying nature of that?
I'm not entirely certain. They were both very strong and opinionated women. And I think they both had very strong opinions of each other. And I think at one point they both were challenging each other or were threats to each other or something like that. But they had some very different opinions. They could each individually do tremendous work. And so separately, they worked great and they did great jobs. But anytime they had to come together, it was just a recipe for disaster. But do you have any comments on that for dealing with those kinds of interpersonal conflicts that could occur?
Yes, one is what you did at the first part. It's like setting boundaries, and your boundaries for them was literally having to keep them separate. So looking for setting boundaries. And another thing, and I've talked about this, and this is kind of the woo-woo nice thing, but again, and it was a different organization. Toastmasters' goals are to teach us communication and leadership skills. And we don't do those without effectively if we're not willing to take input and be vulnerable and talk to one another, and and that kind of, and take those kind of steps. So within Toastmasters, I would suggest, trying to see, can they learn how to talk to one another in ways? Maybe they have to set boundaries around what types of things they say to each other and be able to call each other about it. And again, it's often better to do it, off stage, not in the middle of a meeting, because now you've just sucked everybody else's time and energy into listening to this problem. What's often good with problems, the best things that I've seen when you have problems is the best use of problems is when you resolve them successfully to then share with other people, here's what I learned, here's what we learned by going through this. So, but it's just going to vary on the people, but it all comes down to, you've got to have boundaries, you've got to have trust, and they kind of interweave together. Anyone else with anything else? Okay, well, with that, Abhilash, we've got up, there's the next Leadership Institute is going to be January 16th.
Yep, the TLI second, the sequel, as they call it, is happening on the 16th. The registrations will open on the 1st, New Year's Day. And also there's one more event coming up very soon, next Friday, especially for contestants. It's about how you deal with Zoom and how you send your message in an online contest. So you can register for that on the District 7 website, and that's happening on the 11th. With that, I think I would like to thank Cate. That was a wonderful session. I learned a lot, certainly, and I hope everyone did too, and a very interactive session. So thank you for the participants to keep it engaging.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for your help, Abhilash and Carol, to keep this thing moving. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, y'all have a good weekend, and hope you have a great Christmas season, holiday season.